Nothing to do
What
with
is it?
TikTok. It's all about having
access.
power to restrict access because they're saying that China's scooping up all the data. Guess what? He goes, that's exactly what these other companies are doing too.
Yeah.
They're all scooping up your data.
Yeah.
Because China represents competition, and they developed an app that's the most addictive app ever. The Restrict Act is what it's
TikTok is.
a systematic framework for addressing technology-based threats to the security and safety of Americans. Interference and manipulation of federal elections. Undermining the democratic process to steer policy and regulatory decisions in favor of the strategic objectives of a foreign adversary to the detriment of the national security of the United States. Impact the country's critical infrastructure and digital economy. That's easy to do. You can impact it. What if you impacted it in a positive way?
That's an R, that's a D, that's an R, that's a D, that's an R, that's a D, that's an R. This is not a red versus blue issue. So this is an us versus them issue. We need to vote these people out.
Now, the Restrict Act not only makes it illegal for Americans to use TikTok, it is the Patriot Act 2.0 for the internet. It would give unelected bureaucrats in the Department of Commerce complete and unfettered access to all the data in our computers, our phones, security cameras, internet browsing history, payment applications, and so much more. It throws the Freedom of Information Act completely out the window, no transparency whatsoever, and it criminalizes the use of VPNs with up to 20 years in prison and $1 million in fines. Dangerously, we can't even challenge this in court. Now, this is a direct threat to our fundamental constitutional rights and freedoms, and it's a threat to our democracy. We cannot allow this to pass.
Someone known as the Secretary of Commerce will have some pretty incredible power over all of us. The Secretary of Commerce is an appointed position. It's appointed by the president. There's no voter input. The Secretary of Commerce can also create an advisory committee. Why is that scary? Advisory committees are normal in government. Yeah, usually they are, but it's because they all adhere to Chapter 10, Part 1, Title 5 of U.S. Code. This advisory committee will not adhere to that part of U.S. Code. That part of U.S. Code specifically states that everything that happens in a committee, all the people who sit on it and all of their activities, everything about that committee has to be available to the public. The fact that the advisory committee for the Secretary of Commerce under 686 doesn't adhere to any of that means they don't have to tell us anything about the decisions they make and what they do, what they talk about, or even who's on it. So an unelected official with an unelected group of officials gets to make some very drastic decisions about our day-to-day life, and specifically considering what are called transactions in the bill. These are things like the messages we send online, the content we interact with, the things we buy, and how we buy them. It covers basically everything the internet touches. Whether it is a product that is sold in greater than 1 million parts in the US, or an app that people partake of that is more than 1 million users in the US. That means TikTok. It also talks about foreign adversaries. But here's the interesting thing. They bring up foreign adversaries because they want us to think they're trying to protect us. They say the bill is all about data protection and cybersecurity. If it's about protecting what they define, they call it a natural person. That's me, that's you, that's just people. If they're trying to protect us from these cyber threats and foreign adversaries, then why is it that the only punishments, the only penalties in the penalty section of the bill are outlined for us? How is that protecting us? The penalties are pretty wild too. The penalties are like $250,000 to $1 million fines, prison time, and complete forfeiture of all of your stuff to the U.S. government. They can take everything you own, tangible or intangible. So how are we protected with this act? If someone else wants to read the bill and have an educated discourse with me about it, I'm always interested in having meaningful conversation around things that are kind of big like this.
Once the Restrict Act passes, they'll stop banning all your accounts and just put you in jail instead.
Oh great, I can't wait. And for those who don't know, the Restrict Act, which is already gaining bipartisan support, would allow the Secretary of Commerce to monitor all exchanges of information. And they could remove any information deemed as a national security threat, or even throw people in jail for spreading that information. And many outlets have already been posting about how this is a blatant violation of the First Amendment, and it allows the government to remove anybody they don't like by simply labeling them as a threat to national security. But USA Today is not one of those outlets, and they did one of their infamous fact checks encouraging the Restrict Act. They say that the act doesn't give the government too much access to our information because the government will only use it to stop the bad guys. Because we know the US government's always honest, and they would never label someone a national security threat and throw them in jail for, say, exposing US war crimes. Oh, hey, Julian Assange, what are you doing up there?
You should pay really close attention to the Restrict Act because the Democrats and Republicans that have introduced this legislation are trying to market it as something that it's not. It does ban TikTok. It makes it illegal for Americans to use TikTok, but it does a whole lot more than that. It gives power, unfettered power, to unelected bureaucrats in the Commerce Department to tell us what social media apps we are or are not allowed to use. It gives them access, unfettered access to our data, our browsing history, how we're using different apps on our phones. And it basically criminalizes the use of VPNs with some pretty serious consequences. And they're doing all this in the name of national security. Yeah. Now, this sounds a whole lot like what we saw with the Patriot Act. We, as the American people, need to be smart enough to not fall into this trap again, where ultimately we have, again, people who took an oath to support and defend our Constitution, our civil liberties, our rights, but they are hell-bent on taking those rights away, and dangerously in this bill, the Restrict Act, not even allowing us to challenge their actions through our court system. Yeah. This is a very serious bill that threatens the very foundation of our democracy and our God-given rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. And we cannot allow them to do this again.
You know what's even more scary? That co-signers like Lindsey Graham didn't even know they had co-signed on this bill. That these big decisions that are affecting our civil liberties and our freedom are being decided by a bunch of staffers instead of actual senators. It was embarrassing and humiliating, and he should be embarrassed about that.
That he should be, and that is where we have to hold these elected leaders. They work for the people. We're the ones who get to hire and fire them, and we have to hold them accountable to do their job.
You might have meant this as a joke, but if TikTok gets banned, there's actually a pretty decent likelihood that Discord would be too. Because the Restrict Act that tries to ban TikTok doesn't even specifically name TikTok, it just says any app or software that could be a threat to national security, blah, 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 blah. It would be up to the Secretary of Commerce and the Department of Commerce to decide what apps are dangerous and what apps aren't. And based off this leak, they probably think Discord's dangerous. Oh yeah, and we don't vote for the Secretary of Commerce, it's just an appointed position by the president. So basically, an unelected appointee is deciding what apps are dangerous and what apps aren't, and what apps get banned. Let this be your daily reminder that the Restrict Act is terrible, and even if you don't like TikTok, even if you think TikTok should get banned, you should not support this bill. It's awful.
Everybody thinks that they're just trying to ban TikTok from operating in the U.S., and if that's all they did, then I think the bill would be supported by most Americans. But that's not what they're doing. They're not restricting TikTok, they're restricting us. This is the biggest bait and switch that the central government has ever tried to pull on us. What the act provides is that a U.S. citizen using a VPN to access TikTok could theoretically be subjected to a maximum penalty of $1 million in fines or 20 years in prison, or both. Now, the problem is that the language of the bill is so vague that some clever prosecutor may want to pursue this theory one day, and that needs to be stopped. Also, you think this is just about TikTok. It's not. They're trying to create a category of threatening application. Because it is a category, it's very, very broad. And then it gives the executive branch power to name a foreign adversary, any foreign government regime that one of the cabinet secretaries defines, without any vote of Congress. So this is giving sweeping powers to the security state to surveil us, to prosecute us, to limit our internet usage. This is basically the biggest power grab and bait and switch they've ever tried to pull on us.
Are we really just gonna sit around and let this happen? And watch the dominoes fall and know that we didn't do anything to stop it? Are we gonna do that, really? Are we gonna do that? Are we gonna do that, really?